Okay, welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Value Chain Forum, where we will be discussing seeds, grains. We'll be talking about innovation, transparency, communication. You could say that seeds and grains, they're a little bit the two sides of the same coin, you could say. And my goal in this Value Chain Forum is to flip this coin as many times as possible, and so that we have a little bit of a dialogue going from the stage to you, the floor. Okay? So I'm hoping to get as many questions as possible into the next 50 minutes of conversation, where we are joined with a representation from the grain sector worldwide. We have Krista Thomas, who is Managing Director of the International Grain Trade Coalition, Arnaud Petit, who is Executive Director of the International Grains Council, and Jaine Caunt, who is Director General for the Grain and Feed Trade Association. And just having said that, outlining 3 different international organizations on grain, I think we already see the importance of international movement of grain, because I imagine behind every organization there is a world, even if you're all working on the same issues. So before I ask you to sort of join into this conversation and where we try and really understand potential impacts of plant breeding innovation on the grain sector, I would like to first then just ask a couple of questions to you. And maybe I can start with Krista. Just as a starting point, why is it even important for you to be here today to speak to a floor representing the seed industry? What are you trying to achieve here today, Krista?
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be part of this panel today. It's very important for us to be here because, as you said, Jean-Paul, we are two sides of the same coin. We're part of the same value chain. And at the end of that value chain, end users and customers are, it is their desires at the end of the day that impact all of us throughout the value chain. So it's important that we work together to ensure that the innovations that are important globally to deal with the challenges of the future can be introduced into that value chain without undue friction or delays. So we can cooperate to achieve that and cooperate in our discussions with governments.
So that's an open call for cooperation. Arnaud, can you tell us why you are here today?
So IGC is an intergovernmental organization, and the aim is to improve market transparency and facilitate trade by cooperation. So this is why when members of IGC talk about cooperation, it's between countries, but also between public and private sector. And the same challenges as we have for the seed sector is 23% till 30%, I would say, of the grain is crossing a border. So there is the same challenge about international trade. And the second point also I would like to highlight, even the market situation is a bit sluggish in terms of grains at the time being. You might hear that the price is low, production cost is going up. But if we look just in 5 years' time, we need to produce more. Production trend is about 1%, one per wheat. When we look about the demand side, is 1.7% increase per year. So there also there is a message, I would say, to align along the value chain is how to produce more, how it's possible to produce more. And here there is definitively a dialogue we need to develop together in order to move, to be sure that the right message go to the policy makers, because you understand that the policy makers at the time being are maybe disturbed by other things than innovation and productivity. So this is why it's a call also to coordinate our messages to be sure that we have the right policy in the future.
Okay, thank you. Jaine, why are you here today?
Hello, everyone. Hi, yes, I'm Jaine Chisholm Caunt. Well, at one level, I'm here because Michael Keller asked me to. I didn't really want to say no. And Gafta, my association, works very closely with ISF in a number of international forums, such as IGTC and also the International Agri-Food Network. The association, Gafta, that I'm the CEO of, we represent 2,000 member companies in 100 countries around the world. We design and maintain the standard forms of contract on which it's estimated that 80% of the world's trade in grain is shipped. And we run an international arbitration service to deal with disputes. So when your buyer runs away and doesn't pay for your grain, or your container of rice turns up and it's moldy, these are the kinds of disputes that come to Gafta. And alongside that, we do a lot of training and education all around the world, but also trade policy. And this is where we're very aligned, and we're members of IGTC, as I mentioned as well. Gafta very much stands for the free trade in agricultural commodities, and to encourage governments and policymakers all around the world to reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade. But we also very much, and I think this is where we have a very clear line with ISF, we promote a scientific and evidence-based approach to regulatory decision-making on agricultural commodities.
Okay, so you're highlighting that you have a lot in common. I would like to try and think of something that you may not have in common, or at least force you to think of something you may not have in common. In the seed sector, there's a lot of, let's say, excitement, looking ahead both on a regulatory level and a technology level on plant breeding innovation and all the potential that this innovation can bring to agriculture. When you're looking at it from the grain sector and the trade of grains and the international movement of grains, I would like you to try and think about a nightmare scenario for you as to what could happen if obviously nothing is done or nothing sufficient is done on your side, so that we try and understand also your perspective on plant breeding innovation when it comes to the international movement of grain. So please, Krista, what would be your nightmare scenario?
Thanks for the question. I realized I didn't really introduce the IGTC earlier, so I'm going to take 30 seconds to do that before getting into the nightmare scenario. The IGTC is a group of global and national grain trade associations. So as Jaine mentioned, Gafta is a member. We have Alejandra from NEGA, another member in the audience today. And we work on issues that are common for all of our members from across the world. So one issue that's another commonality is we're very active in advocating for electronic trade documentation, e-FIDOs. We also focus on non-tariff barriers, and some of the most important non-tariff barriers that our members have identified include pesticide MRLs and seed innovation, both traditional biotechnology and plant breeding innovation that we're talking about today. So when I think about a nightmare scenario, you know, I've been working in the gene editing trade policy space for a while, and the saying that keeps coming up is we don't want to make the same mistakes again that were made perhaps for traditional biotechnology. So for me, a nightmare scenario would be one where the trade risk or the trade uncertainty around genome editing in the grain trade or market access challenges prevents or delays the innovation that we need very, very seriously. And a question I get often is, well, why is the grain trade worried about that when we're talking about products that are indistinguishable from conventional plant breeding? And if I may, I'd like to take a moment to talk about that. So for the grain trade is different, mostly very different from trade in fresh fruit and vegetables, right? Because we're dealing with very large, homogenized shipments. An average vessel would hold 60,000 metric tons of grain. Has anyone in the audience ever seen a grain vessel at a port being loaded? Couple of people, that's great. It's hard to describe the scale of what that actually means. 60,000 metric tons, I understand, would fill about 32 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So we're dealing with very large quantities. And grain being a fungible commodity means that any grain of the same class can be mixed together. So number 2 yellow corn from Iowa is the same as number 2 yellow corn from Nebraska. They're functionally equivalent. And thanks to the commingling pipeline, by the time we get to a vessel, we're dealing with grain that came from 1,000 different farms, right? 1,000 different farmers choosing their own seed varieties and their own hybrids that are commingled in a system. So if you put yourself in the place of an importer buying grain, you're concerned with making sure that you're complying with your own domestic laws and regulations and policies. And when you buy commodity grain, you're not buying Granny Smith apples or a known variety. You're buying a mix. So that poses some uncertainty about how that is going to be managed in trade, and I think that's an level of uncertainty that we have to clarify over the next short term.
Okay, so finding ways of managing traceability in a situation where things get mixed up in bulk. So there's a nightmare scenario in the fact that traceability is no longer ensured. Arnaud, what would be your nightmare scenario?
I would say we have already had a bit of flavor of the nightmare scenario. It was with the war in Ukraine, is a lack of trust between the stakeholders. And when you start to get countries say, I need first to produce for myself. Secondly, is also, if I cannot produce for myself, I need to find some originations, and it will be better to do it bilaterally and to have specific regulations. And that means you end up with what Krista said, and you start to have unpredictability on your trade. Because then your rules are changing, traders cannot necessarily respond to the demand. And that means you can look in medium term what will be trade, the price, and you start to have some shocks and further shocks on your grains market. So that's, I think, the first point. The second point is also you increase your cost of trade. Just to bear in mind today, when we talk about total cost of trade, so you have the grain is around the raw commodity, 45% of the cost. Cost of transportation can go from, depending the journey, but from 17 to 23% of the total cost. And the rest is SPS, all the non-tariff measures. So this is why if you don't have trust between countries and they start to elaborate further criteria or further cross-check, you just increase that level. And that means at the end, you have an impact for the consumers, but also, as Krista said, and I think it's a very important point, we look always at grains like it is wheat, it is maize. But indeed, you are feeding so many sectors about food, about feed, fuels, with all of them the specificities or dynamics. So therefore, developing this regulation, very specific on a bilateral approach, indeed, you are limiting the potential of your sectors to deal with a global demand. So that's, I would say, really the nightmare scenario. If we don't have trust between countries, then you lose all the flexibilities that the global trade can provide to the society.
Okay, and I guess countries will have even less trust if they feel that the value chain itself is sort of firing shots at each other. Now that will probably lead to even more mistrust by states. Jaine, your nightmare scenario then?
My nightmare scenario is not being invited back here next year and to have an opportunity to network, to meet, to share with all of the members of ISF, because I think this is a really important conversation that actually needs to move forward. But aside from that, the nightmare really, I think, is a combination of what both Krista and Arnaud have said. It's really about international trade disruption, confusion, lack of consumer confidence, asynchronous regulatory approvals across governments, coupled with geopolitical events, lack of trust in nations, all coming together to fundamentally affect global food security.
Okay, so the intention was not to spend the next 30 minutes or so talking about the nightmare scenario, right? I hope you understand that. It was just to put you into the mindset of how the grains people think of the nightmare, okay? Now, I don't imagine anyone in this room would love to create a nightmare situation for these guys, okay? But still, you may have, I don't know, questions, comments, concerns, perspectives you would like to share on the importance for you of plant breeding innovation, how you would like to see that happen, and how you can ensure that it happens in line with the interests also of the grain sector. So my idea now is to really open the floor and try and get as many questions in as we can. So who would like to fire off a first perspective, please?
Hi. Yes. My name's Naomi Stevens. I'm from Bayer, and I also chair the ISF Plant Breeding Innovation Coordination Group. So I'm very pleased that we can have this conversation. I heard one of the commonalities that was mentioned as you introduced yourselves as science-based regulation. And I'm interested, I didn't hear that in the factor in the nightmare scenarios. Where is the role for science-based regulation in this, and what is your contribution to point back to that in amongst a world that is potentially going chaotic?
Okay. Who would like to take that one? Krista? Yeah, have a go.
I can kick that off. It's critically important, Naomi. One of IGTC's roles is to interact with governments and to advocate for open rules-based trade. We have a set of principles that we use when we do that, and science-based and risk-commensurate regulation is very important and key on that list, as well as sharing what the impacts of a policy may be on the grain trade that perhaps government regulators are not always familiar with, and making sure that a policy will actually achieve its objectives rather than just providing administrative burden or adding complexity to the value chain. I think the challenge comes in when we think of that green map of ISF and we see that it's not universally green. And even when it is green, if we scratch below the surface a little bit, there are differences in the way GMO or is being defined, or the process for determining that a new variety is not a GMO. So science-based can mean different things to different governments, and I think they need our practical help to move forward.
Okay. Anyone want to? Yeah, please, Jane.
Yes, I think having a science-based approach and an evidence-based approach to regulatory decision-making is very important. And it's something that Gafta advocate on a regular basis at Forum, for example, in Rome, at the FAO. We attend, delegations to Codex, WTO. We strongly encourage all our members and non-members to sign up and recognise international standards where they exist, and also where they don't exist, perhaps because of a lack of resourcing for governments to think about how they can pay more attention to developing these standards to avoid different areas starting to effectively go off on their own and develop their own standards. And this pervades a lot of the work we do. So for us, our interests are also in things like MRLs, maximum residue limits, for example. But we also have technical firms who belong to Gafta. So we have laboratory analysts, we have fumigators, and we have superintendents. We actually run an approved register scheme for all of our technical trades, where all of these companies are actually assessed against an international standard, whether that's ISO or Gafta's own international standard, by a third party, and then get effectively the Gafta seal of approval to be on the approved registers. And we also persuade people, whether they're members or non-members, to actually use these firms through our contracts, which require people to actually use technical firms that are on the approved registers. So I would say that approach to the importance of science, the importance of evidence, actually runs through almost everything we do.
Maybe just one thing. Former Prime Minister Thatcher describes the government like a lobby machine inside. And something important, so you are in contact with the safety side, and what we see with IGC, where we have contact with the Ministry of Agriculture or Trade, they don't have necessarily the same perception. And I think a challenge here to be sure that the science-based approach is well understood is also within governments, having the different ministries having the same understanding of what we are talking about. And this is why, for example, in January, so we did together with IGTC, but also ISF, a first meeting on gene editing, what does it mean? And we realize indeed how some different ministries don't have exactly the same perception like the safety or the safety or health ministry. So that's something to take also in consideration if we want to be sure that science-based approach can irrigate, I would say, all governments.
And I can imagine that given the bulky trade that you're involved with, you might have more access to the trade ministries than maybe potentially the seed sector, I guess, potentially. I don't know. Any other questions? Yeah, we can.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Sam Crowell with the American Seed Trade Association, ASTA, and maybe building on Jean-Paul, your provocative question, I would just say that from a seed sector perspective, we're kind of living in a nightmare situation right now. It takes us 5.5 to 7 years to get a GMO trade approved. It costs $120 million, and it's not because we're managing scientific risk. We're managing legal risk. We have to make sure that when you all hit the port, you have certainty. So with growing global consensus around a suite of technologies and the promise that it poses for us to deliver solutions in the face of climate change, how do we collectively talk about managing legal risk and disentangle this misperception that this is a safety issue And where do we have that conversation and partner together so that we can correct the record and actually deploy these technologies? Thank you.
I'd be tempted to ask Jaine on this one, no? I mean, you might have at least some sort of legal perspective on this, no?
I think you're right. You know, it is about legal risk, and it's legal risk driven by consumer perception, driven by particular views that are put out in the media. It's not really about safety. And how we actually untangle that is not a simple conversation. However, I think one of the things that would help is when regulators, for example, do approve a particular trait or a particular product, in my view, they don't often then actually stand up and say an awful lot about the fact that they've made this decision. They're quite happy to make the decision and then let the companies involved in trading all of these products then explain it's safe. And I think there's probably more that government regulators could be doing in terms of standing, you know, if they're happy to make the decision, they should stand up and say that they have made this decision and it's safe.
Okay, yep.
I guess mine's a little bit. Yes, my name is John McMurdy. I'm with CropLife International. So I guess it's a similar question. I think we are aligned for the most part on what we want to accomplish from a policy standpoint. When we go talk to our government counterparts, it's just what that map is not going to be completely green for the foreseeable future. I think we can appreciate we're going to have to live in the disjointed world we have beyond just sitting on products for indefinite amounts of time. What are other near to medium term solutions? So to manage legal risk, it's an unanswerable question, but I want to see you guys try.
Okay, so maybe Krista, you wanna try further? It's a thought experiment here, you know?
It's an easy question, John, thanks, yeah. I think the answer depends to some extent on the commodity and the trait. Introducing a genome-edited variety of wheat poses very different challenges, I think, from a genome-edited corn or canola. So the discussions, in my mind, have to happen at the national level in the exporting country, because it's only the farmers and value chain in an exporting country that can decide how much risk they're willing to take on in exchange for the benefit that that trade offers. If you have, I'm drawing a blank on a specific example, but if you have a trait that offers real value to farmers, offers a solution to a problem, there's probably more discussion that can be had about the trade-offs globally, but that has to happen at the national level.
Arnaud, you have any other ideas?
I would say so. We heard a lot about togetherness from the beginning of today, and in London also it's a buzzword. Togetherness. Sorry, we don't start from scratch. So as you say, there is already a map. We know already the regulations, and maybe something for international organization is more to work about how it is possible to build some bridges between these different regulations, which are already in place. It will take ages to say we will force one region to change its regulation, but for the trade, how to operate on this different area of regulation, that's something to start, I would say. I would start by that, how we can build bridges between these different regions, because we have so many differences, I would say, for the time being, where some countries are very looking on the product and others on the technique. You will not change that fundamental. But it's how trade can work. And I think here, as an international organization, we have a responsibility to highlight or to stress for the administration how to work with that differences. And I'm sure that we can be agile enough. The regulation can be agile enough to address these differences in order, again, for the trade to be very efficient. And if we do it for bulk, that means we can do also for seed, definitively.
But I'm just wondering, at what point does the market consider there is sufficient regulatory coherence that you can actually then move grain around with confidence, and how much the market will simply be shy up until a certain point? You know, because it obviously takes two to tango, right? And what we're talking about, a sort of a vision of regulatory sort of clarity. Yeah, that might take a while. And at one point, there's also the market that dictates, well, we're not shy anymore. Like, there's enough. Like, at what point do you know?
I think that you have two things. First of all, as it has been said, you have the communication with the consumer side. And here, so I would say the value chain should go a bit further. Because, you know, food industry and retailers also have their say, and they have their voices. And are we sure we have all the same alignment? Not always. So that first thing is going further in the value chain. The second aspect is, I will take the example also for GM. In one point of time, you know that Europe had a very strict regulation on GM, but they started to say, why not indeed for the traders from US to make the control in US? And before the cargo moving, we test, and if it is okay, no further control. So providing some practical certainties, I would say, when the trade operates, I think should be a starting point. There is how to go further, particularly for gene editing. If we move, if we have in a short period of time several varieties with gene editing, we will need really to address that. So here again, we have all the chain to work on certifications and to show it is feasible.
Okay.
Sam from ASTA again. A lot of what is dictating the current trade certainty is the size of scale that the value chain is operating on. Where are there opportunities for diversification in supply chains to deliver specified products to markets?
Yeah. Krista?
I can start here. I think Jaine may want to weigh in as well. There are absolutely opportunities for niche products delivered under identity preservation systems where there's a value that incentivizes that product being separated from commodity grain. But commodity grain is around 80% of the total grain traded globally. It is a very efficient system that delivers important nutrition to the world and supports industries all over. So if what's hidden in the question is, can we just do everything as identity preserved? Absolutely, that's just not feasible within the system.
Okay, quick reaction.
I was just going to add that some of our members trade either much smaller niche crops, could be spices, for example, which are sold in obviously in much smaller quantities but still very high value, or pulses, for example. We have a big container trade under Gafta contract. But even at bulk, I mean, I think what we've seen with geopolitical events such as the invasion of Ukraine is that supply chains do and will find a way around and will look to source commodities from different originating countries if they can, you know, because our supply chains are very resilient.
Yeah, good afternoon. Mark Kuhl at Corteva AgriScience. So building on kind of the same theme, it was mentioned before that the seed and grain trade are two sides to one coin, but on the balancing edge of that coin are the farmers, and our job is to enable farmers from both sides. And the question I had was, and this was picked up a little bit before, is, I'll be very provocative. I'm not naive. I know there's business interest behind this, but I'll be provocative. Why are we trying to change regulations to fit our needs instead of other way around? If the businesses on both sides of that coin can work together on systems that would allow global food security and enable our farmers, is that not a pathway perhaps to an end goal? And in that same vein, if you think that's something that can be accomplished, you know, what role would an organization like ISF have in that? Thank you.
I'm happy to start with this one, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree with you. But I think, I mean, we don't have farmers as members generally because our membership tends to be from whenever the commodity leaves the farm, more or less up to the point of first processing. But a number of our members do obviously have farming interests themselves. And farmers themselves are very affected by regulation. And I particularly remember a discussion that I had in Rome at the FAO a few years ago. And I was talking with some policymakers there about MRLs. And they seemed to have the impression that MRLs was just something that corporate companies worried about. You know, this is a corporate problem, you know. Why are you coming to talk to me about this scientific corporate problem that's really got nothing to do with feeding the world? And what I was explaining to them was if, for example, you're a small lentil farmer, shall we say, in Ethiopia, and you have planted your crop and you have used all the products that were appropriate for you to use. Your commodity has already been forward bought by a trader who's planning to commingle it and sell it onto the world market. All's good. But if suddenly the country that was planning to import this product changes its regulatory regime or its phytosanitary regime overnight, that's really bad news for the farmer because ultimately the trader can probably go and source the same product somewhere else, but the farmer can't ungrow his crop. You know, he's already treated it. That's there for that particular life cycle of the crop. You know, and the plans that he may have made or she may have made in terms of what they're going to do with the profit are all up in the air because of regulations that were made over the far side of the world that nobody actually anticipated. But the people that it affects the most are the farmers.
If I could build on,
Yes, please,
on
a
that
quick
just
one.
very briefly. A few years ago, IGTC and ISF both developed guidance for our respective members that encouraged early communication for developers to come talk to the value chain about before launching a product, and that those discussions very much have to include farmers. Second point, super quick, is that when all countries import and export grain, but there are regions of the world where the population is growing very quickly, where the climate is not suitable for grain. So a lot of grain is imported by Asia, Middle East, North Africa, and the regulatory philosophies in different parts of the world are different. And we're driven by what the importing country government wants.
Hi. First of all, congratulations in engaging the public. I think you can see that we're engaged. My name is Alejandra Castillo. I'm the president and CEO at the North American Export Grain Association. So first of all, thanks for this forum, because it is a conversation that we need to keep having. And I kind of want to piggyback on something that Jaine just said around, this obviously involves farmers, but I'm always very nervous when the assumption that the grain trade or traders also make or break the market is somewhat misconstrued. Because, as Jaine mentioned in that Ethiopian example, potentially the grain trade could redirect and source from a different origin, but the problem is the interpretation of standards, the openness to interpretation of standards is what's causing the majority of the problems. When a standard is set, it is the standard. The problem is that as governments, as populations change, as needs change, a lot of the standards are not at the same level as the current needs, right? And so the openness to interpretation piece or conception of that or preconception of that, it's really a very tricky issue to handle. But I want to go back to this idea of risk management as well. So NEGA and other associations, and I'm sure Gafta, IGTC, we've talked about this in different ways. When we are looking at biotech events, we're really asking for three main pieces of risk that should be considered. Risk assessment to determine what is the pre-commercialization process, danger, if you will, or issues that we should be aware of. There is risk management, pre-commercialization, during commercialization, and post-commercialization of what happens when that biotech event is introduced. And then the big one, I think, where we're still working towards collaboration is risk responsibility. What happens in the event that the biotech event disrupts the market, disrupts farmers' ability to not be able to on-grow their crop, disrupts a grain trader's ability to reroute. And that is not just left to the biotech space, it is a communal space, but it starts at the biotech space, right? And so lastly, everything that we've talked about, I think, can be over-focused on what isn't working. But today, 90% of our supply chain is safe. It is science-based. It is managing risk. It is looking at updating regulations and protocols and regulatory frameworks. Otherwise, none of us would be here. So I do think we have to shift the narrative to why isn't it working, to how can we improve upon a system in which we have. And today, I think that is the biggest threat to all of us, is a fundamental belief that the systems that we have today do not work. And that is not further from the truth. They do work. They're not perfect. They're not meant to be, because we're not dealing in pencils. We're dealing in food, in fungible commodities. Therefore, by their own nature, to use pun intended, we're constantly having to recreate, reimagine, reinforce, re-implement processes and procedures. They're not set in stone, if you will.
I have to say, I really agree with you on that point about the resilience and the adaptability of our supply chains. I do think we have a good story to tell. And as you and Krista and others will recall, many discussions around COVID, for example, about how we could keep supply chains moving. Actually, we had a really good story to tell in terms of how quickly the grain trade was able to deal with issues at blockages of ports by making port workers, key workers, so they were actually allowed to attend and start unloading the goods. So yeah, I do agree. We do have a good story to tell. That doesn't mean there aren't things that need fixing, but we do have a good story to tell, and we shouldn't underplay that.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, so we have two here, there's another one over here, so I think we'll just take your questions, comments in one go, okay? Make sure we hear.
Thank you. Siobhan Walsh, Irish Farmers Journal. The EU, Christoph Hansen has said that products used in the EU or which are banned in the EU will now have a zero MRL for coming into Europe. How will that affect your businesses? And Krista, given what you said about the Iowa and the Nebraska grain all going into the one boat, how practical is the EU DR regulations? And they keep being delayed. Are they likely to be delayed again?
Okay. Do any of you have knowledge of the specific kind of EU system? Yeah. Do you want to maybe a quick reaction then on this one?
A very quick reaction is that we really support the importance of, because of the grain trade in the way it's been described in the room today, global standards are critically important. So there are standards for MRLs that are set through Codex, and the EU's approach is moving away from the scientific basis of those standards. So that's a concerning policy direction. And with respect to the EUDR, Jaine, I don't know if you want to weigh in on this as well, but again, one of the basic principles that we advocate with governments is to consult the grain trade, ensure that you understand the impacts on food security of the policies you're going to put in place. Talk to us about the complexity you may be adding to the system. Are you adding costs to a system without measurable benefits to achieve your policy direction? So these are questions we would ask with respect to any policy.
Just to say, I think you've summed it up very well, Krista. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Hey, my name is Simon Shapiro. I'm from Orbum. We're a deep tech scale-up and one of the fastest growing companies in Europe in the tech sphere. We use MRI and AI to see inside of food and seeds and create actionable intelligence. So my question for you is, what data are you missing today about your product that would help address the challenges that I've been hearing so much about during this forum.
Okay, so so what does innovation and technology look like for the grain sector when it comes to understanding what's in the bulk? Do you have any plans on this? Any ideas? Any action plans?
I think we have two things to look at for AI. We analyze markets, so I would say AI is used already, price predictive models and so on. But I would say today the most important is what we don't know, indeed. And that's a matter we still need more data in order to feed really and to look about the models and the predictive approach. The second aspect I would say on AI, to be fair, major exporters are very transparent. You have everything. You can work in terms of technology, they are very good. Where there is still this weakness in the importer side. And we look and we see with eFITO, just an eFITO solution, which is a simple system, I would say, for country to exchange with a digital system. How many importers countries are just implementing that? If we want to have an AI system for the traders to know where the vessels, I would say, is consistent with the regulation or whatsoever. We don't have that system yet, indeed. So if we want to be more agile, and that's, I think, really beyond the togetherness is how we can build a system, agile system. We need really the both sides, not just, I would say, the seed producers and the traders, but also between importers and exporters. And today, there is still a discrepancy from the importing side in moving towards this new system to help, to facilitate, I would say, to provide some certainties also for the traders when the contract need to be operated. So this is why in AI, definitively, we have plenty of applications possible, but I would say we have still how it turns concrete, and we don't have yet that really to grasp the value of this new technology.
Okay, I think Jaine wants to weigh in on this one as well.
Yeah.
We were talking about it just before the session.
Yeah, I think certainly in terms of the kind of data services that you're talking about using AI, obviously our sort of analytical laboratories are very much the ones, they're very keen on new technologies, new abilities, so they would be the ones very much sort of looking to take advantage of all kinds of technologies that will meet their business needs and the needs of consumers ultimately, and whoever is actually buying the commodity. In terms, I mean, we've already mentioned digitalisation of the trade, which is very much an interest really of all three of us. We mentioned things like eFITOs, for example, digitalisation of documents. I mean, I think with AI in general, I mean, it's something, it's got such huge potential across a whole range of things, but certainly from my perspective as a trade association, my interests in AI are more around what are the policies I should be developing for my staff about what's appropriate use of AI. What are the policies I should be developing for our arbitrators about what's acceptable use of AI when researching, drafting? Because it just has such a huge potential across a whole range of different roles and skills.
Okay, we'll have one more question here, please. Briefly introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Soraya Bertioli. I'm from the a scientific research scientist at the University of Georgia, United States. I've been working with peanuts for the last 25 years, both in Brazil and in the United States. So I think I'm a minority here. Most of you are from different trades. So I'm very pleased to learn a lot from you. And it's been fascinating to hear all of these because that comes home to us. Peanut, although can be seen as a small grain, is very important as food nutrition worldwide. And Argentina, Brazil, and the United States sell mostly to Europe and Japan. There is a problem with aflatoxin, a potential problem, in which the countries of origin, their domestic regulations say we can have 20 parts per billion in our countries. But Europe decided without scientific evidence that would only accept 4 parts per billion and is moving towards the limit of detection. So very soon we are sending seed or grain to Europe with less than 4, arrive in Europe because of transport with 5, 5.5, and is rejected. So it's a huge non-tariff barrier. Breeders are working tirelessly to try and get genetic gains, but very little genetic gains because it's mostly an environmental problem. But so what can you do about that? Because that is a problem that is going to stop the selling of peanuts to Europe.
Well, I mean, your problem obviously is a concern, and I'm pretty fond of peanuts myself, so I'd be rather worried if I couldn't get a hold of any. But it picks up on a number of the issues that we've touched upon both here on the panel and in the audience, which is really about the difficulty of having international standards set by Codex and then having certain countries and regions which decide to actually move away from those standards and develop their own. And obviously a lot of the work that we do and Krista does through IGTC is very much to advocate why we all need to have a consistent and predictable trading environment, and that Codex standards are set on safety. You know, you can rely on them, and that countries or regions that sort of move towards developing their own will actually start to cause supply chain problems for their own population, exactly as you've indicated.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, I think we got about 10 odd questions, so that's already not bad. And I hope that it helped to at least understand what might be possible. One of the things is that there is a need to work on these sort of international frameworks and make sure they then trickle down on the national level, and that the market gives confidence both to consumers and to policymakers that it is delivering responsibly. And that market requires this dialogue, because you're on the same side, well, you're on different sides of the same coin, as we have said. We've flipped this coin many times. My last question to you would be, what would be the next flip for you? Like, what would be a kind of a next step that you would like maybe to invite the seed industry to either do something or be invited somewhere, some kind of quite practical next step that you can imagine in your various organizations? Now's the time to invite this seed sector in. So, Krista, an immediate practical next step.
Well, let's keep working on the projects we already have, like the one under the IGC, to help communicate the challenges specific to the grain trade in other global forums. And let's keep cooperating on really transformational, creative regulatory solutions to these issues. Okay. That sounds difficult, though. Transformational, creative, regulatory processes, that sounds difficult. Arnaud.
Yes, and try to be even more focused, I would say, on gene editing particularly, because we understood that product is coming soon on the market. So can we have, between the different organizations, to formulate some recommendations, I would say, before really that things are really moving on concrete? Because if we can have a better understanding about recommendations for this and trade on gene editing product, that would be, I would say, anticipation of the dialogue. I would say we are not WTO, but if we can bring that debate to WTO, it will help, I would say, to try to get what we need for the trade to operate, but also to be sure that companies have also uncertainties on the regulations when we talk about breeders, because they need also to plan investment. So it's not just for, we're not just looking for the products which are coming soon, but that's the next generation of products. So that's very important, and the aim is by January 27 to come with recommendations.
Okay, perfect. Jaine.
And very much in agreement with what both Krista and Arnaud have said. And I also think on a very practical level, it's more opportunities like this to bring together grain organisations with the seed sector and other allied sectors to meet each other, to know who the contacts were. I wouldn't have known who to contact about peanuts, for example, being imported into the EU. So I think the degree of actually having those contacts is very important. And then I think perhaps thinking more about how we can personalise and humanise the problems that we're experiencing for policymakers. Because if we talk up here about detection limits and things, they will just switch off and think, well, what does it matter? And surely it's a good thing if we reduce it. What we need to do is to actually create more stories which show the impact of what those policy changes mean.
Yeah, and we have our lentil grower in Ethiopia, and we have our peanut grower as well. Like, that's two stories. And to come back to Mark's point, maybe then the missing side of the coin is then the farmer and the grower, you know, maybe to get that group also more involved and make that more human, I guess. 'Cause it's their stories in the end.
Absolutely, but also the consumer, who would probably be appalled if they discovered there were no peanuts coming into Europe. You know, I think it is about trying to find those stories that will resonate about, you know, which actually translate the impact of what is being legislated on. And also, you know, we're living in a world where we are trying to, on a range of fronts, actually hold up international standards on a whole range of issues, not just codex, you know, but the value of internationalism, the value of countries working together, you know, and this is very much an area where, you know, we do need to take a role and show the value of those kinds of connections.
Under pressure, under pressure. Okay, thank you so much, Krista, Arnaud, Jaine, for having been with us. And thanks to all engage in the conversation, and well, we wish you a great rest of the Congress. See you next time.